dissertation is primarily about demonstrating scholarly expertise, and in the book, that's assumed. So all the things that go into demonstrating that expertise in the dissertation have to fall away. Anything that I know most people don't include proper literature reviews anymore, but there's still almost always a section of dissertation that functions that same way. Part of that assumed expertise is also about voice, about bringing yours forward. There's a kind of, often in dissertations, there's a kind of passiveness, a kind of recursiveness. There's the citation, often sentences will start with the citation of someone else. So your voice in every at the level of the manuscript and also at the level of paragraph and sentence has to come forward. I know that's half an answer. You want to do
I was going to start from a more structural standpoint and sort of a practical thing. I don't know the last time you've sat down and read your dissertation cover to cover. My first suggestion in terms of prioritizing and figuring out things like what's an article, what should be pulled out of here, what should become the book, what should be here, what needs to be added, what needs to be written. It's probably been a while since you've looked at it cover to cover, and there may be things that surprise you about it. Like, that's really good. I had no idea I said something that's really, wow, that's well phrased. I don't know when I wrote that. Or, this is really stupid. Like, what was I thinking? I think sitting down and reading it cover to cover, not in a single sitting, but can be very, very helpful. You can start taking notes for yourself, about what you're thinking already about things that you want to change, what you think can be completely skipped over and omitted, what needs to be written from scratch, what doesn't fit and might be carved out nicely for an article that might go on and on and on about something that you realize is not the core of that chapter. And I think very seriously about things that you might want to add, things that you think should be there, particularly if you've been postdocing and teaching. Chances are you've been explaining your project or something like your project or the things that work around your project to a group of students who are not at all expert in it. And you probably add a lot of context and sort of frame it very differently. And I would think about the framing as you sit and read. But I usually recommend that someone puts away the dissertation for at least 6 months or a year in a drawer and not look at it. And I think coming back to it with fresh eyes can be very instructional before you get any input from other people, because I do think other people are part of this puzzle too, but see what you think for yourself first.
Can I just add one thing to that, which is that I've sit on a lot of dissertation committees, and often one of the things that happens at the defense is that we have a great conversation about what the real headline of the project is. And often the person comes out of that defense with a slightly different and I would hope clearer idea about which of the many points is the most original and the one that's carrying the weight of the evidence in the dissertation. And I think starting from those kinds of conversations and then thinking about what is the headline for this project and how you would have rewritten the dissertation or how you would rewrite it as a book to pull that main point through it. And often that's a better way to think about the rewriting project than as just, a task. I've got to turn this into a book. What you have to do is change the voice and often make the message sharper, clearer as you go.
I'll add as well, in thinking about my experience on the promotion and tenure committee, one of the questions that always comes up when people are evaluating a first book is what kind of impact has it had on the field? And if you're writing a dissertation whose impact is designed to reach to a fairly small corner of a particular field, that may be all well and good for the dissertation. But for the book, you want to make sure that, I'm a classicist, so I'll say, if you're interested in Homer and you're writing on the Iliad, you want to write a book that isn't just of interest to Homerists. You want to write a book for people who are interested in, X, Y, and Z, but it's not just going to be X, and the X shouldn't be too small. So it's something else to keep in mind as you're asking, as Laurie said, what's the headline? What impact do I want to make on the field, and how do I want to change the field? A dissertation often may point in the last chapter to a changing a certain part of the field, do a paradigm shift, as they used to call it. A book can make that paradigm shift its center and foreground in a much more assertive way where future scholarship in the field should be moving, in your view.
Hi, I have a question based on your last comment, which is I do interdisciplinary research and my project is interdisciplinary, and I'm really concerned about audience, how to situate my work in a particular field or expand a field. What do you do when that field is potentially multiple? In my case, literature and art history, but I'm sure this applies to other people as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are going to be able to respond to that. Let me let the editors respond first, partly because I got great advice from the editors I worked with.
So your question is about identifying who the audience is or reaching them, or
how do you gear a book towards multiple audiences? Do you choose one? Do you foreground one? How do you produce a book that is genuinely interdisciplinary? Oh, sorry. Okay.
right? So part of that obviously is a methodological question that is. So much of what we do at NYU Press is. Well, there's an ongoing argument about whether it's interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, which those are, but so many of the areas that we do combine methods. As a publisher, I can understand the kind of anxiety about, well, my work sits between two fields. To me, that has at least the potential then to reach both of those fields, as opposed to something solely in art history. We're always looking for work that travels. And one of the ways it travels is it's legible by people in different fields. So an advantage, if you do it right, an advantage of interdisciplinary work is writing necessarily in a way that people in both fields can understand it. There's obviously every field has its lexicon. Some, frankly, are more generally legible than others. And you have to have some kind of consciousness of that, of what it is that you're doing that is more broadly applicable. Scholars are very selfish creatures. They will read what helps them do their own work. And if your work can help them, they'll read it. If it feels distant, opaque, not something they can apply, they won't.
I'll just add to this, if I might, because although I'm the director of the press, I've actually never been an editor, and I came up through the business in marketing. So the question of who's your audience is very top of mind. And I would just say, and you'll see this on the proposal, how to build a prospectus that we handed out, and we have some more here. Even if your work is interdisciplinary, you should think really hard about who is going to spend $30 on this book, because there's always a core audience, and then you're going out in concentric circles after that. So write as you wish, but when you write a proposal to the publisher, make sure you are clear about who your core audience is, and then we'll work with you to find, the extension of that.
I just want to add on very briefly to that. It's much more of a worry, I think, interdisciplinary work from the perspective of somebody who's sitting in a department to teach a certain kind of course, who's been hired to fill a line. And we don't think that way in publishing. Yeah. Many people at presses have two different disciplines that are on their list, and that's totally normal. There's yet more paper, because we all kill lots of trees, so there's more prospectus advice and things on the end of the table that from me. But when you work on your marketing and competition section, which I think whether you're writing this or just thinking along these lines, you're really thinking what other books appeal to these kinds of readers. I'm sure you're not the first to actually bring together these two areas. What other books did it? How did they do it? What kinds of techniques did they use that were successful? And I think much of that has to do with making your argument and where it fits central, not about thinking about the two different fields. I realize there's a great worry about, am I speaking the language that these people hear or that those people hear? And I think a lot of it is, the kind of jargon that you use for each of the fields, translating that into something that will make sense, not just to those two fields, but to all of the fields in which your project potentially sits. And if you can do that, then nobody looks at it and says, wait, it's this plus this plus this. It's just, this is a book about this topic. And, something about cosmopolitanism, for instance, nobody goes, wait, is it history? Is it literature? Is it politics? Where is this? People just, it's a theme. And I think it's how you frame your introduction that's especially important.
Yeah. Sort of continuing with this question about audience, and maybe this is an inaccurate perception of maybe how some of these academic books fit within a continuum. It seems like on one extreme there are books that really speak to colleagues in the field And then on another extreme, there are books that are more geared towards maybe to be used in an undergraduate course sometimes, books that are broken up into more digestible sections, shorter chapters, maybe less kind of detailed and intricate arguments with respect to kind of finer points in the field. How, from the publisher's perspective, how do you perceive, I guess, this continuum, and where's a good place? I mean, I'm guessing you're probably going to say somewhere squarely in the middle, right? But on another level, I'll use a lot of books in coursework, some that are more useful to me as a scholar, some that are more useful to me as as a teacher and an educator. How do you see that, I guess, that divide, and how important is that for all of you, and the determination and the public, the whether or not something is publishable? Anyway.
Well, whether or not something is publishable and how you publish it are two different questions. I think part of it goes beyond audience, and it has to do with your subject as well. I mean, you can take a very tiny subject and make it interesting, as Joy was saying, to a larger audience. Or you can take a very big subject and make it only of interest to the people who sit on your floor, in the building. And that's your choice to make, because we have, as university presses, we have the ability to publish across the whole continuum. At the smaller end, it's more difficult for us financially, but we don't say, oh no, we're absolutely not going to publish this. So a lot of it comes from what your hope is for what the book is going to be.
I'm sorry, can I just add one? I'll promise I'll stop doing this too much. But I was going to say the continuum, I think, is a really good way to think about this, and I don't think it's squarely in the middle. I think be very clear about who you want to write this book for. If this is a first book, if this is a monograph, if this is about establishing your scholarly credentials, if this is about tenure, if this is a narrow topic that's, for instance, very archivally driven on an esoteric subject, that's fine. That's what university presses exist for. But be very clear that that kind of book has a certain kind of profile, a certain kind of price tag, a certain reading audience. Those are usually the books that win prizes, and they don't necessarily sell a lot of copies, but they're very important in changing the field. There are absolutely books that we look at and say, okay, it's a first book, but it's, let's say, on the period of World War II, and we can do something with that, and maybe it reaches a broader audience, maybe it reaches students, maybe it is synthetic in ways that we can do something with, but this is so dependent on subject matter, on discipline, and on what your goals are. So I think the worst thing is to think, I can do everything with this one book, because that's really never going to happen. I mean, anybody who sort of compares their project, when I see, it's not happening as much, I think, as I keep saying this so often, no guns, germs, and steel as your comp title. Like, that's the worst example there. And if it's for undergraduate survey, graduate students, seminars, scholars, and general reading public, I look at that and think, this author is very confused and it's going to be a nightmare. So.
Hi. What's a good point to start looking for a publisher?
Boy. So, I mean, I speak to people, let's say, late grad students, so people who are well into writing their dissertations. That's usually about the first point at which I'll meet them. They'll introduce themselves, introduce the series editors through their mentors. I like having those early conversations. I like hearing about projects at that stage. It's often a fairly brief conversation because I try to be conscious of as we've been saying, the different roles that dissertations play from books. They're not the same thing. And I don't want to get people, before they finish a dissertation, thinking too much about what this eventual book will look like. But I like hearing, and part of what we do, editors do, is map fields. That's really what we're doing. We're gathering as much information as possible about who's working on what and making connections in our head. So I like hearing about projects at that stage, and that can be a valuable interaction for you in getting some sense of whether it resonates with that editor, with that editor's lists, but also, again, some preliminary ideas about what would need to happen or what excites the editor about your project that is going to be the core of a future book.
Can I qualify this a little bit? This is beyond graduate student level, but
Right.
For someone who's writing a book that has been out in the field for a while, like at what point, when you're working on a project and perhaps it's not finished, but you have an idea of where it is, I'm just wondering where you recommend the writer is at.
So it's your second book then?
No, my
The
first.
first book.
But you're beyond graduate student. Yeah.
Yes.
It's a hard. I mean, I would say when you can write a a good proposal when it's clear enough in your head that you can do that schematic work, that you can lay out clearly what this is, what it's covering, what its intervention is, the so what of your book. And that's a fine point at which to start talking to an editor.
We are readers too, so it's hard to talk to people when we don't actually have something concrete to look at. So,
But I guess I'm saying, if you have a good proposal and the publisher likes it, what does the publisher maybe expect that you've completed by the time, they approve the book? Like that process, how much should you have done up front when you're looking for a publisher?
well, how much do you need to send out for review generally?
This differs from press to press. I'm sure Oxford and NYU have different standards on this. For me, for a first book, we're looking for a critical mass, which would probably be 3/4 of the manuscript. Sometimes it's a complete manuscript, but not always. For second books, it's less. And beyond that, people I've worked with, I don't know, what do when we did 110 stories, what did we have? It was a conversation.
Yeah.
I think it was a
I had
conversation.
one idea. Yeah, and that was work, right?
Yeah.
But I think what you're saying is sort of how can you approach an editor? They have an idea, and then the editor turns around and says, "Okay, give me the full manuscript." It's a little intimidating. So you want to hesitate not to, because then you feel that one chance with that editor was gone because they didn't have that full manuscript, right? That's part of what you're asking.
I just so you know, so you can relax about that. That's generally not how it works from our perspective. If I'm interested in a project, I will remain interested. We're part of the longue durée here of scholarship. So we talk to somebody 2 years later. They have chapters. I remember that conversation, and I'm sure Susan's the same way. It's not that we expect that conversation to result in a manuscript on our desk the next day.
And the varying publisher to publisher is so extreme that there's nobody here from a representative, let's say Chicago, where they would say potentially, here's a book proposal, we're going to offer you advance contract. We don't need to see this. We're going to lock you in to just give us the full manuscript. You can't send it anywhere else. There's a whole variety of different things that happen, which is why it's very important to actually be in conversation with the editor when you're submitting that proposal about what the expectations are, and also know what you're looking for. Some people want to put the proposal out as, let's say, a balloon to test this project. Does anybody care out there? Other people are, very much looking for something concrete and a commitment, and that's, I would say it's very different on publishers' sides, and every press has a slightly different policy and sometimes makes different ones for different people or different series, and there's also differing expectations on the part of authors. If you're 6 years away from having your first book manuscript fully done, and you're 6 years away, that's probably a little too early to be contacting publishers, because it's very hard to see what the field is going to be in 6 years. Now, plenty of projects turn into being delivered 6 years later, but if you're at that stage already where like I'm seeing, let's say, 1.5 years, 2 years, or my postdoc is coming to an end, or I'm at the beginning of my tenure track, or God forbid, I'm in year 6 and my department really wants to know what's going on with me. Like, there are a lot of different things that we come into situations not time-wise of our control. So I think it's just important to have the proposal that we can engage with so that you can actually have a very specific conversation about your project with somebody you might work with.
Could I just add one thing to this? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I was just going to say that it's a great example of the difference between fields. In my fields, Susan acquires in history and I do media studies and American studies. In my fields, if a book was 6 years away, it means it hasn't been thought of yet. In your field, that's just getting started.
I had something just delivered after 27 years under contract. I'm in it for the long durée.
One thing that I was going to say is that when I talk with colleagues, assistant professors, people working on their first books, I think that the biggest danger I see is waiting too long to get into conversation. People want to wait until they feel like they have every answer to every question that could be asked of them before they show this book proposal. And I can think of people here who shall not be named who have what I know is to be a very good book proposal and a very good project based on an excellent dissertation, and they're reluctant to let it out of their hands. And there are two reasons to encourage you to move faster at that stage. One is that this takes a long time. So you need to get the thing underway so that you can begin the process. The other thing is you learn a lot from, these are smart people. I think you can get that window. You learn a lot from being in conversation with an editor. You can learn a lot. You can get a really good advice about the framing of the thing, very valuable advice. So I would encourage people to move a little faster than you think you need to move, because you'll get something out of doing that.
On the flip side, I think all of you are junior faculty. Is that correct? This is not an audience of
Some
graduate
postdocs.
students. Okay, there are no graduate students here. Is that right?
Probably some.
Okay. I mean, the flip side. I just wanted to sort of identify the audience a little better. The flip side that I see, one or two ways, is people who say, I'm filing in 2 months, or I'm filing next week, here's my proposal. And that's, in my view, for a proposal, like an actual physical, I'm going to show the editor something, a little too soon, because it means that you haven't put any thought into how the dissertation is going to change in the book. It's not too soon for the kind of conversation that Eric's talking about, which is sort of putting out some feelers, potentially having some conversations, but I see a lot of people who in the pre-professional rush, or the feel like if I don't have a contract, I'm not going to have a job, are having those conversations with editors perhaps prematurely, before there's been actually a thought between the dissertation as the first draft of the book, that their advisors may have used a line, something like, I told my students to write it like a book, so when they're finished, it will be ready to go. There still needs to be a step in between. It's still the first draft of the book manuscript.
I think the gist of my question, I had a very precise and maybe pedantic one about chapter length, but I think the question really is, how much should one be expecting to communicate back and forth about those kind of questions with an editor at a press? If, let's say, there's interest in a proposal, things are moving forward, and I'm actively revising right now, and feeling good about it. But one of these questions I keep coming up against is like, is this chapter too long? Is somebody going to tell me that before I've given it to them, or should I just feel okay about giving a press say 2/3 of a manuscript based on my hunch of having shortened sentences, shortened paragraphs, tried to make it more readable for a general audience? Are there specific things like that I can be bugging an editor about?
Well, it depends on your editor, I guess, and their tolerance for bugging. Yeah.
Or rather, is it safe to get that sort of feedback later on, or is it something that's going to kill me up front?
Well, there's no death involved. Nobody's dying so far. Let's see. So I think it's a fine question to ask if you're already in touch with someone. Is the book signed, or? But you're in touch, you're talking with an editor about a project. I think it's a fine question to ask. I mean, generally, just a generic advice on chapter length is, I generally only get alarmed when there's tremendous variance between chapters, which I do see, actually, not infrequently. And that tells me something's wrong with this narrative. There's a chapter that needs to be more chapters, a single chapter that needs to be broken up, or someone doesn't have, basically, the concern generally for me is if someone doesn't have control of the narrative. And one of the ways that's demonstrated is a certain consistency over the scope of the manuscript. By the way, as long as we're talking about chapters, I was at a 19th century Americanist conference, and one of the professors was speaking about this, and I thought it made great sense, which was, she was saying that if a chapter can be read on its own, it's a failed chapter. It's not a book chapter; it's an essay, and it concisely sort of said what I've said in much less elegant ways to authors many times, which is this is really, and it's a little bit. This is one of the things that does happen with a dissertation, that to make it writable, to make it doable, people tend to make the chapters into little books. That makes for a really boring book. In fact, it means it is effectively repetitive. So it's a side note, but just as long as we're talking things at the chapter length, that's one way to think about being in control of the narrative, that it progresses, that it builds.
Unless those chapter lengths are so extreme, let's say 100, 125 page chapter next to a 40 page chapter, these aren't questions that I find it very easy to answer without actually having engaged with the full text. So I think sometimes there are things that you have to work out on your own, knowing that you're going to go through this revision process. There's going to be at least one more big stage of this, possibly more. I wouldn't worry overly about that in terms of your editor, because the things that will kill a project, not that will kill you, not that will kill us, that will potentially do a project in the review process, have everything to do with the presentation of argument and about the analysis. All of the other stuff, it's very important, but it's going to be finessed, it's going to be nuanced, and there's time to work that out.
I'm going to jump in and ask, can you submit a proposal to multiple presses as long as you're transparent about it up front?
I would say many people are not transparent about it. You can submit to whoever you want.
You can submit to whoever you want. You should be transparent about it, and then it's the publisher can tell you how they feel about it. For me personally, at the proposal stage, you're welcome to do whatever you'd like. Show it to us, show it to other people. I do tend to, if someone tells me they've shared it with 8 other publishers, then I tend to think this person has no idea who they actually want to publish with, and it's just kind of a cattle call. So that's not very encouraging. If they tell me it's with you and 2 other presses, the same 2 other presses I see, because we all are interested in the same thing, that makes good sense to me. Then it's up to you and the publisher to decide. They may say to you, look, I'm interested in sending this out for review, but only if we have a first shot at it. And you can say, then decide whether that's okay with you or not okay with you. I would say if you agree to that, you should also put a time stipulation on it. So when I ask someone for that, I say, give me 3 months to do this, not just give it to me and wait to hear in whatever time frame I feel like getting around to.
Yeah, so a preliminary question to the previous one. What are ways in which we can think about searching for, or even, well, courting is the wrong word, but searching for publishers at least, especially, I'm thinking about my dissertation project. There's a title on there's a title released by a publisher that my book would be in direct competition with. We're actually looking at this, the same material, the same subject, but this publisher, and especially this series where that this other book is carried, is a music series. So I'm a musicologist. I'd be if my book would be picked up, it would probably be published under the same series. So how are ways in which we can think about which publisher is right for us, especially since we don't want to saturate, the market, as it were, with our proposal?
You all think of that, yeah.
You want to go, or I'll
Go first, and I'll go.
I think we spend too much time worrying about competition. We live in a distracted world. We're lucky if people pay attention to one of those 2 books on the same subject. And I usually think I've learned to think about people who are writing on similar or even the same subjects that I'm writing on as people who are helping me create a market for my own work. They're opening a space for me. Someone has read the book that you're describing in this series and now knows about this subject and is maybe very interested in looking for the next work that either builds on or disagrees with it. So I would take that worry away. I think looking for a press, you should look for a press that has an interest in the kind of work that you do. Look at their books, look at their list. If you admire the books that they're producing in your field or close to your field, that's a very good starting point for a relationship with the press.
I was just actually on a panel earlier this week, and one of the other presenters said, the most important thing when you're looking for a publisher is to do your homework and make sure you're picking somebody who's a good fit for your subject. Because 90% of the time, if your book is rejected, it's because it doesn't fit what the press is doing. At NYU and Columbia, for example, we both do media studies, but we don't do film, and they don't do television. So if you do your homework, you would know which of the 2 of us to submit to. And I understand your point about worrying about competing with something that's already on the list, but it's very important for publishers to have a critical mass in a subject so that we can promote it properly and we can make our own mark on the discipline ourselves.
I'm sure you're doing this already, but it's worth emphasizing that something we forget, I think, in our desire to make our own mark and our, maybe it's the hours we spend in the library working on our stuff on our own, but it's easy to forget that in general, in your subfield and in your field and even beyond your field, in other departments, people you might meet by chance, there's a lot of desire to help and give advice, and there's nothing more that people love nothing more than to be asked for help and advice. And so I would really, rely on if it's not your dissertation committee or a bunch of people around you and wherever you are now, just don't hesitate if you feel the impulse at a cocktail party or at a lunch or a meeting to just ask the person whose work interests you or seems like they have their head on straight how they did it, where they went for help, and it helps immensely. I know that sounds like anodyne, universalist advice, but it's true. You learn a lot from people, and they're happy to help.
And I would go so far as to say you can reach out to people who you don't know, who might be in the cohort right ahead of you, who have published in the last year or two, who might not be from the same school, who you might not know, but you admire their books, and to write to them and say, I'm working on my first book. It has resonances with yours. I was wondering about your experience with this press. People are very happy, as you say, to give advice, and they're also happy to tell you all the things that went wrong. So the more people you talk to, the more you'll start to hear what that experience was like, who they worked with, what to expect, and there won't be a single person, I'm pretty sure about this, who will say that, if the press hadn't put more time and money into marketing and publicizing the book, that it wouldn't have sold better. So you'll start to realize that's not one press that you'll hear that about, but pretty much all of them. So, the kinds of questions that you should be asking about an editor about or asking about a press should largely come from the kinds of things that you're hearing, repeatedly from people about what made their experience either special or made it not as wonderful as it could have been.
I'm trying to figure out how to frame the question. So I have a completed dissertation. It's in the field of Jewish studies, and I'm really debating, as I think about turning it into a book, going the university press route versus going the trade press route. I see the topic, though I hope a serious piece of scholarship, as also having resonance in contemporary Jewish life. So that's why I think it could go in either direction. Do I have to, as I think about writing the proposal, I guess I need to clarify what's the story I want to tell and how do I want to tell it. There are two different ways of telling the same story. But do you have any guidance? Does a university press, if I steer the story or the way I tell the story in the direction that I think would appeal to kind of contemporary Jewish readers who aren't necessarily academics, do I then lose the interest of a university press?
No. University presses publish trade books as well, and to point to my former employer, I mean, in history, it has one of the most distinguished trade lists there is, in addition to having a very distinguished monograph list. So I think that's not what the question is.
I mean, the question to me is primarily really a professional one. It has so much to do with what you want that book to do, and that speaks to. I mean, I'd love to hear from you all about how that plays. I mean, I know it differs a lot from department to department, school to school, but.
Well, I could say, because for me, I don't need for a tenure process or something like that. I don't need that. What I want is the book to be read. That's what I care about. I want the story that I've told to be out there. So I guess a question back to NYU Press would be, if I submit a proposal, would the press then say, oh, you know what, we're going to send this makes more sense in the trade department, we'll send it over there, or do I need to make that decision prior to submitting?
No, we would make that. We would make that decision, and I mean, we've also, we'll get projects that we'll recommend to other publishers because it's not the fit isn't quite right. Sometimes they are commercial in a way that just don't make sense for us, and we'll say you should be talking to a commercial publisher. So yeah, that's an easy call for an editor to make, an easy, fast call.
I will just say, the ability to get through the door at a certain kind of press that's not a university press may be a very different process for you. So there are certainly specialized publishers, and certainly publishers for whom doing Jewish studies is their bread and butter and who will accept projects directly from authors. But then there are commercial presses that will not let you through the door, do not want the editors' names out there, will not be sort of happy to get your email with a proposal, and will expect that you have an agent representing you. So it very much varies press to press and the kind of place that you're talking about.
But most commercial publishers only want to talk to agents.
So I have, and this is not for you. It's just an observation. It's a cautionary note that I don't know how many conversations I've had, and these words have come out of my mouth too, where people say, "I could do this as a crossover book," and I once had a very good editor say to me, "Actually, you can't." Everything that you've described to me about this project is that it is an academic project, and you should write the very best academic book about the subject that you can. And I thought that was a very interesting thing. I did that. It was a good outcome in that case. And I have seen people try too hard to force in the direction of a crossover book based on some kind of idea about what they have in their heads about what the common reader wants to read. And I think you got to look very carefully at the work, not just on what you want, what the work will signify, which is very important. If you're in a tenure process, you write the academic book. It can have a wide audience, but it still has to have that academic kind of effect on the field that's demonstrable. But you really want to look at the work and at your own abilities to write a particular kind of way and see what's appropriate for the subject, for your own talents, for the work as a whole.
There are also lots of ways in which, for those of us in the concerned about tenure track publishing in particular, to make a mark beyond the impact and the appearance of the book itself in using, I don't even know what Vine is, but I'll just mention Vine. But using YouTube, using blogs, or getting involved in with colleagues and setting up some kind of a website that showcases work in a particular area, or that's pushing a certain methodology. And there are lots of different multimedia ways to make an impact these days, and it's worth spending some time now while you're mulling over what kind of impact you want to have, thinking about taking the initial steps to making that outreach in a way that accompanies the book and helps it reach the people you want to reach.
I have a vague idea from what I hear from my colleagues as to what happens if a publisher signs you on and you give the book manuscript in a stipulated time period, but it would be good to have some sense that what are the various stages that come after you've submitted the prospectus, and if there has been a positive interest in it. And I know timelines can really vary, but just to get a sense of those stages and some kind of reasonable timelines.
So this, again, this will vary a bit from publisher to publisher, but for us, let's say you have, I'm not sure what you mean by interest, but the first, you've talked to a publisher, they ask for the manuscript, and they say they want to send it out for review, which we'll all do. Generally single blind.
We won't all do, but that's part of the why you need to talk to publishers. Even at university presses, there are presses right now that are not sending things out for formal review to other places. So even that stage, we're going to go through all the generics here, but there are variations across all different presses, even at university presses.
Yeah, I guess there are still. Yeah. All right. So
NYU.
NYU and in general, I would say in general, I would make this partially prescriptive. This is what you should expect. If you get a piece of paper back that's an agreement from a publisher and it has not been peer reviewed, it's worth something to the publisher and nothing to you, basically. So we can talk more about that. But so I would expect that your project would go out for review. If the reviews come back in the constructively critical to static range, you'll write a response. The publisher will get an editorial memo and a package together, take it to committee, come out of the committee with one of three responses: accept, decline, or revise and resubmit. Assuming it's accepted, a contract is issued. Among other things, you have a date for submitting a complete manuscript. And when you submit that complete manuscript, let's say it's 6 months, 18 months, somewhere in there generally, at least for us, it will go out for review again, generally to the reviewers it went out to the first time. The second time around, you're really reviewing, or we ask our reviewers to vet the revisions, not the manuscript all over again, if you know what I mean. That's why the response to the readers the first time is very important, because it really becomes the map for what you're going to do, and it's an agreement really between you and the editor. If that review process goes well, as it generally does, there'll be final revisions, and then you're preparing the manuscript for final submission, and then there's many more steps after that. But I mean, that's the part that leads up to it leaving your hands finally.
The only thing, there's a faculty board stage at university presses. To have university press on the spines of the books means that we all have some kind of faculty board. Usually they're called faculty board in the United States. They're called the delegates at Oxford University Press. They're called the syndics at Cambridge, different names. But apart from the in-house decision-making of the editorial group, led by a publisher, a president, editorial director, sales, marketing, the other people who are participants in that, there'll also be a group of scholars who are allowing the imprimatur of the university to be on the book. And they see materials as well. At least at Oxford it happens around the same time as editorial board, done on a rolling basis, not in a single room setting. At the University of California Press, they sit down it's usually every month, but they have a few months that they skip. And so, the faculty board are specialists in the field. They're sitting and reading the projects, maybe cover to cover, maybe not. They're reading the reports, they're reading what the editors have to say, they read your response to the reviews. And that's a really important part of the process. That's what makes university presses different from, let's say, an academic commercial press like Palgrave that doesn't have a university press name attached to it.
Can I interject to just ask a timeline question just to pick up exactly on that one, because you went through the steps very quickly. So I think and I'm thinking very much as Dean, thinking about promotion to tenure. You come up for tenure in the fall of your 6th year. The book is ideally out by then. So can you count us back, with kind of relative estimate timeframes for each of the steps you described?
Well, let's start with the finished
Yeah.
book. So for us, the finished book would take 10 months, meaning from the time that it is final, we have all the different pieces that we need, art, permissions, all that, and it's handed to production. It's 10 months to produce a book, roughly. It can be a little sooner, a little later. The stages before that can vary significantly, depending on what stage you're at and how long it takes you to do the revisions. But let's say a book is... let's say a proposal and 4 of the 5 chapters are sent out for review, and that process, say, takes 3 to 4 months to get a contract, or at least to have a decision from. But let's assume this is all positive. So it's a yes. It's 3 to 4 months. You then decide together in the issuance of the contract how long it's going to take you to do those revisions. Again, generally, I would say it's 6 to 18 months. It can vary tremendously depending on what your schedule is like, and then it comes back in, it's the same thing. It's another, say, 3 months for the publisher to oversee, 3 to 4 months to oversee the second review round. Final revisions should be pretty brief, 3 to 6 months. And then you're at the stage of handing it over to the publisher.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but this is, and I'm kind of playing dumb here, but you want the book to come out by the time you come up for tenure, right? So that means the summer before you start your 6th year. You want the book between hard covers. That's what you want readers to read. Then that means by the fall of your 5th year, it should be in that final done stage. It's now going into copy editing, and everyone thinking about who's going to write your tenure referee letters are feeling confident that it's out of your hands. You can't stop it. You can't withdraw it. We've all heard nightmare stories along those lines. Okay, so fall of 5th year, it's out of your hands as the author, and it's in copy editing. It's going into proofs, etc. That means, counting backwards, or you talked about 6 to 18 months to get to that point. So we're now thinking, back to the fall of the 4th year, back to the spring of the 4th year, really back to the fall of your 3rd year, right, as an assistant professor. So the as Laurie said, to echo her emphasis on keeping an eye on the clock, it's really important to think as you move out of that 6 months, you filed your dissertation, you kind of give yourself 6 months to finalize your job, prepare your teaching, find your feet, find your new apartment, etc. You need to be thinking pretty quickly about what to do with that manuscript and get the advice you need and the help you need from your dissertation committee, from your new colleagues. Everybody is happy to help a new colleague, and from other people in your field as you move into the composition process, so you're well poised in your 3rd year to have the conversation with the editors.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first is about if you have any recommendations about approaching editors. Say you're at that stage, you have a book prospectus lined up, and now you picked out some presses that you think are going to be receptive. Is the best way to shoot them an email? Is it to go and meet them at fairs? I've heard from people that they really like to, editors really like to have firsthand contact with authors, but what's the best way to find an occasion for that contact? Or setting up a phone call? What is the protocol, the etiquette, basically? And related to this question is then, what exactly, when an editor asks you, what is the argument of your book, what are they looking for concretely? Is it a paragraph? Because, of course, in academics, we're used to writing extremely long-winded on occasion, and the expectation here is that we have a topic which demands an entire book. So how to distill that into the argument, and what is it then that's going to be the argument that convinces you?
I can start this off. The second part is, you've heard about the elevator pitch. Give us your elevator pitch. 1 to 2 sentences. Think about the fact that every stage in the editor hears, we're going to continue to distill it more and more for our colleagues who know less and less about this. We don't need the whole book up front. Chapter 1 does this, chapter 2 does this. We need to have the, in a nutshell, 1 to 2 sentences is counterintuitive. What is this saying about the field and how is it changing it? Not it fits in these 3 different fields or it speaks to those things, but exactly what it is that your book is interpretively doing. The first part, I would say, varies certainly editor to editor and also author to author. There's certainly people that I've published that if I had met them in person the first time, I would never be working with them, And they might say the same thing about me, to be honest. At the end of the day, we're publishing books. We're publishing pieces of writing. They may be in electronic form, they may be in print form, they may be in forms that we can't even anticipate in the future. I care about the written word a lot. And I never mind getting a proposal or a written piece from somebody about what their project is, because that's what I want to engage with. There are people who buzz around booths for years and years talking to me, thinking that making nice and chatting with me is going to make me want to do their book. And they may be perfectly fine to talk with, but you know what? I actually care about what they've written. There are also people who believe that the only time of year to pitch editors is right before the major meeting in the field. And to be honest, if I open up my email now, I will have 25 more new messages from people that I don't know asking me for appointments at the AHA, which is only 3 to 4 days long, and is not really the best time to pitch me on things, because 3 to 4 days of my life that are not the best days of my life are not when I'm going to give you my most undivided attention if I haven't met you and don't know about your project. I'm not saying I won't meet with people at conferences, but smaller conferences are often very valuable. Things that are 300, 400, 900 person conferences are very different than ones that are 5,000 to 6,000. I think expecting that someone, that you're going to pick up the phone and cold call an editor is very old-fashioned. And by the way, phone solicitations, from companies, has the same effect on me that people who call my office and sort of say, but I want to tell you about my book. They have no idea what time they're reaching me. Maybe I'm not eating dinner, but maybe I'm in the midst of several different things, and a new project is not one of those things. I'm on the very introverted, antisocial side of being an editor, though. So I'll just say, I don't mind when people send me a note, and I take plenty of feedback from people in general. I might be on a college campus, as I was, last week and many of the weeks of the semester. Someone will say, there's somebody working on such and such, and I'll think, oh, that sounds interesting. I'll write to them. Or someone might say, I have a student that's working on this. Would it be okay if they reached out, or a colleague who's working on that? I think that's absolutely fine. I know the editors differ on this enormously, but I don't particularly appreciate when someone writes a sort of letter of recommendation for a colleague and says, you have to look at this, because I make my own judgment call about what I should look at, and having people sort of give lots of recommendations doesn't actually endear that project to me. It makes me think someone's not using their own skills to contact editors, but rather relying on a network. And those people who are very heavily networked at more elite schools usually get lots of play, and those people who might have very valuable projects who are not part of those elite networks or who are shyer might not have those advantages. So I would say there's no single way of doing it. And there's one book that we haven't mentioned here on the panel, William Germano's getting it published, which comes out from Chicago. So none of us are getting any royalties from this for talking about any books like Bill Germano's. But There's a lot of very sane advice about how to approach publishers and the different ways of doing it. But all of the publishers have websites where we talk about how we want to be approached. So if we say, do not send the full manuscript, do not send us a 10 megabyte attachment on a Saturday night and think that that's okay. If we say we want to see a proposal and we want to see it in print, in hard copy in the mail, send it that way. If there's a group mailbox, you can send it that way. Make sure you're addressing it to an editor who is alive, who's still working at that press, like that you're sending it to a person who will consider your work. Because I know it sounds ridiculous, but I still get mail from people who don't work at Oxford and haven't been at Oxford for years, you know, and that's not a particularly impressive way of approaching them.
I think just because we have a useful difference on this, and so you have a sense of the range of things. I prefer to meet people at conferences. It's where I do my best work. I do it from crack of dawn till late at night. I like seeing, like we talked before about mapping a field. It's one of the ways for me that's really useful is meeting tons of people at my main conferences. I get approached beforehand, and again, just to give you the range of possibilities here, I want recommendations. I'm looking for recommendations from. A big part of the work of acquisitions is kind of triangulation, and so when people pop up out of nowhere who I have no context for, it's very hard for me to make a call. Whereas if it comes from somebody I already know, it comes through a series editor. This is a time for you to use your mentors, to use your contacts, to provide an introduction. Email's fine, but I certainly prefer meeting people in person. Emails as a way to set things up. Certainly, again, just general courtesy, timing. Don't write me 3 days before a conference and say, "Hey, do you have any time?" That's
definitely not during the conference.
No. I've gotten those. Walking up to someone, just an editor, kind of harried looking at a conference and saying, "Hey, by the way," again, you can get introduced by someone and try to make an appointment for later. But anyway, that just because again we have a different take on that. The other thing I just want to touch on was the presentation of an argument. Partially because you really should be able to do this, and partially just because I think it's a useful exercise. That your book you should be able to ultimately present your book in 3 sentences. The first sentence is the subject, it's the thesis statement. The second sentence is the intervention it's making, the scholarly intervention it's making, and the third sentence is the argument, which is to say the so what. Those are the 3 key pieces. Again, obviously you're going to elaborate on those, but I think it's a fine place to start to bang out those 3 sentences. It's a great bit of discipline for yourself to be able to characterize it that way, and then you can build from there.
Okay. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask you something about publishing when you're at the beginning of your scholarly career. For instance, is it better to publish for a university press if you're not tenured, for instance, and you want to be tenured, or for a commercial press, speaking about your first book first? And secondly, what's the weight for the tenure process of a book that is not published in English?
Let me take the second question first. So it's somewhat field specific. I mean, all of these answers. So there's going to be a range, and I'll just try to hit somewhere in the sweet spot. But at universities, research universities, R1 universities, as they're sometimes called, publishing in English is not required. We're international institutions, and so it's understood that presses that are well established in other countries that publish in languages other than English are good presses, strong presses. The key is you want to, for a first book, with tenure as one of the things you're considering, is that it's got to be a peer-reviewed press, and that, I shouldn't say got to be. You're well advised to seek out a peer-reviewed press. So I would say you want to keep in mind, balancing the factors of impact. You want, if you're at a university in the U.S., you want your department to find letters, referees to write letters for you with some ease. And so if you're writing, if you're thinking about the foreign language question and about a language other than English, you do want to keep that in mind. So think about your field. Think about how many prominent scholars in your field are comfortable reading in the language you're thinking about publishing in, and then make the call and get lots of advice along the way. But it's certainly, there's no blanket rule about must publish in English as a requirement. It's just a field specific concern. The other question I think I may have answered along the way. Peer review is really the key here. At least that should be your first question, and you should get really good advice about it before you make a decision to move away from a peer-reviewed press for a first publication, especially one that's going to count for tenure.
I'm going to be mindful of the time. I think a lot
Yeah.
of the takeaway is to lower the threshold of approaching editors and being in conversation. I actually didn't do that myself. I actually always felt I had everything done and completed. I think it's really helpful that you're saying you're encouraging the scholars to be in contact with you, to have a conversation, to shape their argument in conversation by having the elevator pitch and the 3-sentence statement ready, approaching you in a mindful way that you're doing other things as well. And I want to talk about 2 other things, actually the writing process. Susan is saying you want to read something. That's very important for you. So we're going to make your assessment based on the writing. So I want to touch on that for a moment of actually maybe from your experience, scholars you've worked with, successfully. Have you learned anything from them or your writers yourselves, some of you? What works? How does it work? How to approach that? How to get things done? Because the timeline is daunting in some ways when you're saying you got to get this manuscript pretty much done 3rd year. I mean, that's what, and so the standards vary across disciplines. But how to get the writing done, and partly for me was, do you submit a manuscript where you still think it's a draft? I was very hesitant to submit something that I considered a draft. I always felt it had to be completely perfect, because I didn't want somebody to say, well, this is missing, and here you're missing 14 footnotes or something like that. That was not my, I wasn't raised like that at Yale. But the writing process, but you have seen people who've done it very well, and also you've seen people who've stumbled a bit and then took not 18 months, but 27 years or something. That's maybe not an ideal situation. Like, how do you actually accelerate that in a way that's productive?
I mean, I do want to defend that 27 years is a second book by someone teaching at a community college. So I just feel I need to rehabilitate his reputation. And actually, in that particular case, 27 years equals the first biography of John Wilkes Booth. That's sort of Life and Times. That will come out for the 150th anniversary of the Lincoln assassination. So 27 years was actually perfect. But for most of you, it will not be perfect. The degree of perfectionism is a really hard thing for editors to gauge, because we don't know your personalities. There are people who feel, getting the draft out is, it's a really drafty draft, like you would show to your writing group or your friends. And for other people, they're never willing to let it go until every single footnote has been fact-checked for the 17th time. So, anything that has large chunks of the manuscript that has like information to come or note to come or notes to yourself, it's probably not something that you want to show to your peers. Think about this as putting your best foot forward. You don't get a second chance to make a first impression. And I think, editors see a lot of things at a lot of different stages, but what's really important to us is that we see something that we can judge on its own terms and think this is worthy of us spending our time on it, but also asking other people to spend their time on. Scholars who are busy, who have a lot of other things that they need to do, and we're paying them, but not that much. And we're asking them to take time out from their own students and from their teaching to consider your work. So, you want at that stage to be in a position where you're proud of it and you know that it's the kind of work you would show, not the kind of thing that, you're going to a conference and maybe you haven't quite gotten it done, but you realize you can sort of fake it in a presentation. That doesn't really cut it for publishers. So, I mean, I would say on the proposal end, which is a short piece, we're talking 12, 15 pages tops, that should be pitch perfect. That should be reviewed by people who are eagle-eyed, the kind of people who will say you have a typo in your first sentence, or this word here doesn't make any sense, or, you've forgotten to put the title of this or your name in the corner, that kind of thing. And that's the piece I would spend certainly to make the first impression. Think about it as your calling card. This is you're asking a press to invite you to call on them to present more information about your project. Do they want to see more? And so I now present myself as totally antisocial and introverted, but I do talk to people. Occasionally, I leave my office. I do go to a lot of conferences, and from first thing in the morning to last thing at night, I do talk to people. But as that piece of writing, I'm looking for someone who cares enough to put a professional job into it. So I think you probably went far on the extreme of like doing things to the nth degree of perfectionism. And I know people who are reluctant to let things go, to the detriment of their tenure cases. And I know other people who are sort of ready to rush, who really should have somebody go, wait, your main title has a typo in it.
In thinking one more time about the tenure process, one thing that a tenure committee, and I'm now thinking not so much of your committee and your department, although that's one of the questions they'll be asking, but really the university tenure committee, or FAS, and in our case at NYU, the Faculty of Arts and Science P&T committee. They're looking at a scholar. The record of a scholar has usually been out of graduate school from anywhere from 5 to 7 or 10 years, depending on postdocs and visiting assistant professorships and all the rest. And they're looking really not at the book and the reactions to the book as the capstone or apex of a career. They're looking at it as a first step, and they're looking for a trajectory. So what you don't want to think of is if you're heading into the tenure track, you don't want to think of the first book as the thing that you're going to achieve and that's what you're going to be judged on, and you kind of go up and up and up and you get tenure, and then it's kind of who knows what after. What the tenure committee is looking for are letters and attestations from you and your research statement and from people writing for you that are showing them a picture of a scholar on her or his way up, and who has a plan and an arc and who's going to make an impact on the field beyond that first book. So in thinking about the timing, one of the things that can keep you moving, to speak to what Uli asked about, is that this is your first intervention. This first book, it's your first intervention. Your next one is right over the horizon. It might take 3, 6, 10 years to finish, but you can see it and you're ready to go there, and your research statement's going to reflect it. So just think of this first book as as your first intervention, your first move into the field, and understand other people are going to be evaluating you fairly on those grounds. And it can, I know it's daunting, but it can actually, if you think of it this way, take a little bit of the pressure off, because your efforts aren't all centered in that one, 250, 300 page piece of work.
Just to reinforce that, as a publisher, one of the things I'm looking at is I'm not just looking at individual projects. We're looking at investing in scholars, and scholars who we think will continue to be productive, whose work is, as you said, really on a trajectory. That's part of what at least I'm gauging. We expect to have a long relationship with our authors. We expect to publish several books by them. So I think it's true also from our end. To Uli's question, I don't think any particularly grand advice about the writing process. I would just say that I think being forced to write proposals is really valuable. People tend to want to write them at the end. I think they should be written at the beginning. It forces you to think schematically about the arc of your narrative. It forces you to think about audience. Forces you to think about competition. All the things that are in what Ellen handed out. I'm sure what Susan handed out. The elements of that are, I think, everyone's better off if you're thinking about that in the first instance. You'll go back and adjust it and edit it as the process goes, but you should really have that in mind. The other thing is, I have had authors who have used me as sort of phallic mommy, call me, I want to deliver this in 3 months, make sure I do, kind of thing. I need a deadline. Generally I'll take that on if that's what they want. And I'm always actually a little taken when people will say, look, you have to give me a hard deadline or I won't do this, and then be shameless about harassing me, kind of thing. So.
I have a question specific to art history, and I'm wondering how can I find out what's an appropriate number of images per chapter for the press? In other words, what are the limitations of the press? Should I look at previous art history books published by the press? So I have a sense of how many images I think I need to illustrate a chapter, which may be more than the press can consider.
I don't think there's any definitive answer to that question. It would probably turn out to be a negotiation between you and your publisher, depending on what you could afford in terms of permissions and what it was going to do to the cost of the book. And none of us here actually publish art history, but I think I can safely say that is the response you would get from anybody.
I've inherited an art history list, which isn't very active. It's a very minimal part of what I do. I do more architectural history than I do art history, but I will say this. Ellen's exactly right. There's no definitive number. It's what the book needs. I'm not thinking of these books personally as exhibition catalogs. I don't want something that was going to be an essay up front followed by just pages and pages of art. That's not an interpretive scholarly art history book for the kind of list I do. I think looking at the kinds of presses that you're considering, be it Princeton Architectural Press, Yale University Press, which is generally considered to have, I would say, you know, the leading art history list in the country. What are the guidelines of what they have in existing books? And these issues of permissions, which used to be totally prohibitive, a lot of institutions have lately, you know, started giving things completely for free, V&A, Met, other kinds of places, so that it's less prohibitive than it used to be. It's easier to publish art history books now, strangely, than it was 10 years ago. I think the same issues of keeping books in print at the same printing quality that the first printing was remains an issue, but I think that from the perspective of the field, there's at least been some agreements between the kinds of institutions that hold these pieces of art and other materials and the publishing field of, you know, the College Art Association, that we're at least at a point where people can publish books in ways that I think was pretty difficult. But I think, you know, CAA is in New York this year. That is the perfect time to go around and spend some time looking seriously at what's at each stand, how they're publishing it, and to make some appointments in advance with some places that you think might be the potential, let's say, top 2 to 3 to 5 picks.
I did want to say one thing about writing. And I learned a lot from talking to other people who have written books that I greatly admired. I actually ask everyone I know who writes, when do they write? What do they write with? Do they write with a pencil? Do they write in the morning? Do they have coffee first? And literally I do that. And actually what you get a conversation is about their thought process. And it's incredibly helpful, I think. It's also helpful to learn that it's doable. It's a practice. I was quite serious to say you have some time right now. You also have holidays, other obligations. But what you're hearing is actually that there are people here who are really interested to hear your argument. And to make that argument, you have to write. And what became very clear, it's not that they want to spend a huge amount of time. They want to spend time with you, yes, and that's great. But they don't want to just hear about it. They want to actually have you have it worked out in writing. For that, you have to write. And in my own personal experience, I can only talk about what actually my dissertation had a 10-page part on photography that my best friend in graduate school read and said, this is really great, and I know you love this, and your narcissistic investment is in this one passage, and it doesn't fit at all. You should take it out right now. So I took it out, and I wrote my second book on photography. So I had a 10-page sort of argument stuck in this other book, which was completely separate, and I needed somebody, and he was really afraid I was going to flip out, and I said, oh, can you let go of this right now? So I wrote one book, then a second book. So it's very helpful to have somebody actually talk through the argument that had already been written down. Secondly, you can write, and maybe you're amazing and you can write 8 hours a day. Most people can't. Most people who actually publish a lot don't write 8 hours a day. They write no more than 2 hours a day. And that becomes more manageable with all your other obligations. And we will send out something. If you not on our email, give us your email. But somebody who's been teaching writing boot camps for dissertations at NYU for a very long time, very effectively. 50 minutes, that's it. 2 times 50 minutes, 10-minute break in between. But no phone, no nothing, no computer, all of it. You're actually writing. You're not doing research at that time. But writing is very important. I think I really want to thank the panelists. You've really sort of encouraged these scholars to be in touch with you and actually, before they are in touch with you, to think through what they are talking about with you. I think that's really a valuable lesson. I think I would have benefited from this a long time ago. So, and I did one book, I think, with you that didn't have a proposal, didn't have a review process. We just did it. So that was kind of great. So actually,
that happens too.
That happens too. And that was a deeply rewarding project because I had an editor who actually really cared about this project. And I think books should be those kinds of occasions where you actually are collaborating with somebody. So I think we have people here on this panel who really have that kind of spirit. So I want to thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's, I think, been very valuable. I want to thank the audience for asking questions. And, you now learned how to approach them in a polite, respectful, and enthusiastic way. And yeah, good luck writing.
Thanks.